listening to Transformation in Trials. Transformation in Trials is a podcast exploring what we must change in life sciences to get treatment to patients faster. I'm your host, Ivana Rosendal. Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today we're going to focus on the topic of how does one actually focus on the patients first when it comes to clinical trials, but also life sciences in general. And today in the studio with me, I have Mark Duman. Mark, very happy to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Mark, could you tell our listeners a little bit more about what you're currently up to?
Yeah, so I'm a pharmacist by profession, so I've always had an interest in medicines. Probably, to be honest, more the medicines taking than the drug making side, but I've been pulled not quite screaming and kicking into that sort of R&D side over the last decade, much more so. And so I look at the entire asset life cycle or product or indeed service life cycle, and we support life science companies, and by that I mean pharma, medtech, and increasingly digital health, to think about how do we use patient insight to co-create products and services, and that includes obviously medicines and medical devices and digital therapeutics. And where we have got those products on the market, how do we use that patient insight to make things even better? And satisfaction is a marketing tool. It's not necessarily something that helps people develop better products. We do a lot of work around informed consent and choice. How do we produce really good quality information for patients to feel truly informed and to make informed choices? And lastly, how do we move from a caregiving system to coaching? So it's not just about treatment, it's also about prevention, self-care and self-management. So we talk about the 3 C's of patient engagement: co-creation, choice, and coaching.
Very cool. And just to set the stage for our listeners, what does the typical patient centricity actually look like when it comes to clinical trials today?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to get away from the language. Language is a really interesting barrier. We talk about clinical trials, and the vast majority of people that you speak to on the street will say to you, what's a clinical trial? But I think we're very good at seeing the world as we are and not seeing the world as it is. So I think first and foremost, and it's a little bit of a cliche, but we need to get in the shoes, not even of patients, but of citizens and of people, and understand their health literacy or their clinical trials literacy. Because I think we start by saying, hi, would you like to take part in a clinical trial? And it's like, no. If we said something like, hi, would you like to get involved in making a potentially life-saving medicine or a life-saving medical product or a digital health product that helps live a better, longer life, people might say, oh yeah, what's that about? We may then need to get into the detail of, well, that involves a clinical trial, if indeed it does, because we are moving into real-world evidence and perhaps hopefully redefining what a trial is and what evidence is. But I think we need to start right at the beginning with what is our objective, what are we trying to do here, and what language should we be using that's acceptable and understandable and engaging, more marketing driven, dare I say, than seeing things from our own perspective.
And I would like you to define another term for me. There's this term of patient advocacy. What does that mean?
So this is interesting. So advocating for patients. I think there's multiple levels. And it's funny, I've been in this world now for 30 years, and I don't think I've ever been asked to define advocacy. So I'm going to do this off the cuff. So I think for me, advocacy, there's obviously, Novo Nordisk did some interesting stuff, the Disease Expert Experience Program, and it's now changed, I believe, to the Patient Voices Group. I've been working on and off with Novo Nordisk for a few years, and their categorization is as follows. Number one is you have an advocate who will run a group but may not necessarily have the condition. You will have a patient who advocates and has the condition and has the ability to both express their own lived experience but potentially garner the lived experience of others to advocate for themselves and for others. And then you have a sort of an advocate who really struggles perhaps, or not struggles, but is the most of us is, what is my condition? What's it about? Leave me alone. I don't want to have it. How do I manage it? Etc. etc. So I think there's personal advocacy. They also then have a fourth category, which is interesting. As a big company with however many thousands of employees, they also then have staff as patients. which is interesting. And this is something I often talk to organizations who are quite new to the idea of patient engagement and encourage them, because there are compliance issues, there are conceptual issues. Why would we talk to a patient? We're not allowed to talk to a patient, which is wrong. We can, but we just have to go through various regulatory and legal approaches to do so. But when you have staff as patients, they're employees, and there's a much, you can start your patient engagement work by often looking within the organization and starting having conversations with them. I was working with a sales and marketing team of a medical device company only yesterday, 120 sales and marketing people in the room, and 4 people came up to me at the end of my presentation where I mentioned staff as patients and said, actually, we've got long-term conditions. We've never thought of bringing that patient perspective to work. That's really interesting, and some people want to bring it to work and are happy to share it. Others don't want that label, understandably, and would rather be the professional, not the professional plus the patient. So that's a very personal decision for people to make.
Interesting. So it seems like from the pharma side, we're trying to reach towards the patients with patient centricity or patient engagement. And then the patient organizations or patients themselves are trying to advocate for their needs. But do these two ever meet, or are they kind of like sailing past each other in the night?
I think fundamentally they could, should, and need to meet. And I think number one is be careful when you say you're working with patients that you're not only working with patient advocacy groups. It's different in rare disease, but I think as a pharma company or a life sciences company more broadly, when you approach a patient advocacy group, I think it's important to say, who's your membership? There's a particular group I work with here in the UK, and I sit on one of their boards. There's nearly 6 million people with the condition in the UK. About 4.5 million know they have the condition, and just under 100,000 are members of the patient advocacy group. So there's a big gap between that 100,000 membership and the 4.5 million who know, or 4.5 million or so, or whatever it is, 4.3 I think it is. So that's a big gap. And then not only is there a gap potentially in quantity, there may also be a gap in quality. In that I think a lot of the patients who become members of patient groups, and I don't know because I haven't done the analysis, but are often patients who are already more engaged. And ultimately what you want to be doing many of the times is that the 4 million who aren't members are perhaps the people you need to speak to most. So I think there is an issue about representation and being very honest and open. First of all, who are we talking to? And importantly, who are we not talking to? And then to talk about, well, what's your shared objective? We're trying to get more people to take a medicine. We're wanting people to contribute to health technology assessment. We're wanting more patients and citizens to get involved in trials. I think start with a shared objective and then co-create that solution. That to me is far better than coming with a solution and saying, what do you think of this? Better to do that than nothing, but I think it's much better to sit down and co-create that with the patients. And one of the things we've talked about over the years is that the medical model does 2 patients. The charitable model, the advocacy model does 4 patients. We're all very much embracing doing this with patients, but I actually think we need to go further. And I think we need to learn from patients, both in terms of it's our data and real world evidence, but also allowing us to innovate. And there's a wonderful website in Portugal, and I keep telling them to set up an ambassador program because I talk about them every week. And I'm saying, can I be an ambassador? You don't need to pay me any money. But I just think conceptually what you're doing is great. It's patient-innovation.com. And they collect stories and case studies of patients who are innovating. And that to me really shows the idea that, we don't just need to be reviewers or co-creators, we can actually be creators. We can determine and in some cases fix the needs that we have. And I think I see a lot of that now increasingly with parents who have children with rare disease. They, as parents, are becoming drug/medicines developers. That's inspiring.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. This is Ivana Rosendal. To get treatment to patients faster, we must have well-functioning organizations. But how do we do that? Well, I have written a story about people who try to make their organizations more well-functioning. It's called Maneuvering Monday, and it is available on Amazon now. You might just get inspired or at least have a good laugh. That is inspiring, but I would be curious, what would the conditions for that be? For them to be able to co-create, how do they engage the rigorous medicine scientists in helping them with creating the drug that their children need?
As always, when put on the spot, I can't remember, but there's somebody who I engage with. He had a condition, and he actually happened to be a medic, which obviously helps. And he set up his own foundation and said, right, this is the condition I have. I'm now going to the genetic experts and going out to the scientific community and to pharma to help find some cures. And I think back to your point about what is patient engagement, what is patient centricity, it's a meeting of experts. And even where you're not a doctor, even where you're a patient or a parent with lived experience, that lived experience is really important. And that's a level of expertise. I often say to people, yes, I'm a pharmacist, so I do understand a little bit more about anatomy and biology, but I'm still a layperson, but I do know and can describe, even if not in biological terms, what's going on with my system and my body. And people say, well, that doesn't make you an expert. I said, well, it makes an expert in my own experience and an expert in my own body. And one of the reasons that in medicine, veterinary medicine and pediatric medicine are so difficult is you get very little from the pet or the animal, or indeed from the child. And so you really need to be an incredibly good diagnostician. If you're not in those areas, please realise that all the questions you're asking of your patient is them sharing a level of expertise and insight. And sometimes that goes unrecognised.
But it sounds like there's also a shift of recognizing that parents in this case, but also patients themselves, may have understanding that is difficult to measure from a science perspective. There is something that you as a patient know that perhaps we might not even know to measure.
Two responses to that. One is medicine and medicines and healthcare a science or an art? Mm-hmm. And I think it's both. And we could wax very, philosophically and lyrically, but I think it's both, and I've often heard people say, oh, would you like a surgeon who was, very accurate but couldn't communicate, or would you like someone who would communicate who might make a slip of the knife? And I would say I want both. And I'm not sure it's not right to ask that. I was supposed to go for cataract surgery about 8 weeks ago, and they could not tell me who was going to do the surgery. And I said, and they were like, I asked it for in writing. I didn't want a phone call with a call centre. I wanted to see something in writing. And a couple of weeks out, they sent me the name of the surgeon, and they sent me a link to an outcomes database for cataract surgery. Number one, I couldn't find his name on it. And number two, and then there was a couple of names similar to his. So I looked up the outcomes data for those 2 or 3 surgeons with similar names, and I couldn't understand the data. So again, back to health literacy, or back to that point of publish and be damned. It's not good enough to give, that I have to demand the information, and then when it's given to me, it's not in a format I understand.
Yeah.
The person who's repairing my boiler or my car or the insurance salesman are all accredited. Mm-hmm. Surely I have a right to ask if the surgeon or the doctor has done this before, and if they have, are they any good at it? And it seems to be that even asking that question into this whole patient empowerment movement is seen to be a little bit rebellious. And I'm like, don't think so. I think, if you were a surgeon, you'd find your surgeon friend who was really good at it. Although I was having a coffee this morning with a dentist who was telling me that he did his own filling 30 years ago, and only recently has it now come out. And I was like, okay, so I think you're an outlier.
But in general, like this whole health literacy subject, I'm interested in it because we are now able to collect more data about ourselves using wearables, also just having more access to our own patient records. But are we equipped to actually understand what all of this data means? And also, potentially, how does it cross over if we get our blood samples and we have some data about when are we out of breath when walking up the stairs? Can we reasonably correlate those two? And what would it take to actually equip citizens in broader terms to be able to manage their own health?
Yeah, and I think that's the second point I was going to come to about that real-world evidence, real-world data. Not just are patients potentially seen as innovators, but ultimately it's our data. And as we move towards data wearables, I think that becomes an increasingly important currency in healthcare. And in the same way, we train, hopefully, and educate our children and adolescents to understand the value of currency, to understand how to do business transactions, how to write a letter. Because I think health literacy needs to be embedded into schools and into citizenship. We need to understand risk and benefits, and we're very bad at risk communication. People would not do national lotteries if they knew statistics, and let's be honest, we don't understand risk communication. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work harder in schools and as parents to really start to educate both ourselves, but also our colleagues, our guardians, our kids, really how to navigate the healthcare system. I think it needs to become part of citizenship. I'm lucky to have a National Health Service in the UK where I phone a number and I'd be looked after. I look at some of the communication through colleagues and on LinkedIn in the US and think, not only do you have the complication and the emotional turmoil of dealing with the condition or conditions, you have to navigate this incredibly and increasingly complex insurance system. I'm off to America on Monday, and I'm going to have a couple of conversations with people in the healthcare system because I'm actually worried from outside that system that the more complicated navigation around health literacy is the insurance and the access issues as opposed to necessarily the treatments and all that sort of choice ourselves. So I think they've got a double whammy in health insurance systems that you have to navigate both the care and the access to the care.
Yeah, I was stationed in the US for a year and had a health issue myself. And got to experience like the wonderful complexity of the US healthcare system. And again, like the actual treatment that I received was great. Nothing to complain about for that. But getting to the point to actually being able to receive treatment took, I believe, 3 weeks until I actually got to get the treatment. And it was a routine issue, but still just like figuring out, well, how do we do it from here? Whereas in Denmark, well, because it is a unified healthcare system.
Same as us.
You just go to either your GP or the hospital and then you're looked after.
Correct. And I lived in Israel for 2 years, and I remember my fiancée, now wife, took really not well, and we had to get an ambulance on the Sabbath. And we don't do monetary transactions on the Sabbath, but the first thing they said when we got in the ambulance was, "How are you going to pay?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, I'll give you a credit card, but I'm not carrying it today." And they were like, "Well, we can't treat you." So I then had to go upstairs because it was life-threatening, and I'm allowed, you're allowed to, do transactions or whatever it needs to be to save life. Broadly speaking, let's not get into Jewish law on this, but I just thought, golly, I'm so not used to that. It's not something that I've ever come across in 57 years in the NHS. I've never had somebody say, "How are you going to pay?"
Yeah. So let's hope it stays that way, because having to deal with disease is difficult enough.
Correct.
So coming back to the technology part of things, we have the opportunity to monitor our own health in more and more different ways. How can we build solutions that actually help patients in monitoring their own health rather than making things even more complicated?
I'd go back to my first C, ask them. Don't build it and hope it works. And this is true whether you're building a product for managers or any product. Go and speak to people. Yes, use your design expertise. And sometimes as user design and human, we don't know what we don't know. That's where the design and the expertise comes in. But can you please combine that with user experience and human factor studies and really getting to the core of user needs? And yes, you can bring that ingenuity in and that design expertise, but I think it needs to be a combination, not one or other. And I would build, back to your point about wearables and this, that, and this thing, I would be building data and digital literacy as well as health literacy into the fundamental building blocks of what makes a, inverted commas, good, responsible citizen. But also taking into account people whose life choices say, I don't want to be digitally literate, or I saw a piece of work. We did some work 20 years ago in Scotland with this traveller community and access to personal health records. And we gave them a paper record in a waterproof, sealable bag type thing because, they didn't want to have the need to have that sort of connectivity into the healthcare system. And some people, for philosophical reasons, for religious reasons or whatever, we are moving from analog to digital, and sometimes you will be carried with that and need to be carried with that. But I think there is something about trying to make sure we bring everybody with us. And it goes back to Nelson Mandela and education, and putting health, lifestyle, well-being in front of that word education. And also responsibility. I sit here being recorded by you, and again, thank you for the opportunity. As a patient, in addition to being a former clinician and a sort of consultant in patient engagement, but I may not need to have the condition that I have if I'd had a better relationship with food as I was growing up. So there's also something about where does that prevention come in? And what responsibility do we have as patients, as citizens, as parents to really think about prevention? Because we talk about it but we all get paid for illness, not for health.
That is true. I've been fortunate enough to record a couple of episodes that will be airing this same season as you, talking about prevention and potentially how could we incentivize pharmaceutical companies to also kind of drag in the direction of prevention, even though it may potentially inhibit sales.
I was asked this question yesterday, which is Pharma really interested in prevention if it will cannibalize its market? And I think the answer is, I once asked a chief exec in a certain, not chief exec, a C-level person in a big company that shall obviously remain nameless. And she said, we'll get you anyway. And I was like, what? She said, well, you have progressive diseases or you'll stay well from that perspective, but you'll get cancer. You'll get something. So I thought, okay, it may not be your company that treats it because you've moved into prevention. And one of the companies we've already mentioned, I believe now has a prevention unit. But again, I think that's because as an organization, they're more of a foundation and more societal impact led than pipeline and profit led and shareholder led. So again, it's an interesting conundrum as to whether you'd cannibalize your markets or whether we'll get you anyway, or whether it's the right thing to do. It's an interesting debate, and I'm definitely not a health economist, nor a shareholder.
Well, and then for building solutions, but also just designing good clinical trials, you've argued a couple of times that we need to actually speak to the patients and co-create, having patients being the innovators. Like from a practical standpoint, can you talk me through how could that actually happen? Because a lot of pharmaceuticals companies, we don't even know where to start.
With regard to clinical trials, and we've touched on some of the issues already, but I think it's about talking to patients, talking to caregivers as well, because they're absolutely key in this, and talking to people, because I think it's also not about, often we want healthy volunteers and we want to approach it, so it's not just patients. I think a good place to start, given the caveat we've mentioned about representation, both in terms of type and volume of people, is patient groups. So here in the UK, we have the Association of Medical Research Charities. So again, you have particular charities who are dedicated to research. Most, if not all of them, are looking at issues around diversity and broader reach, etc., etc. But I think, again, there's something back to, if we have a responsibility to try to prevent disease, to self-care and to self-manage, do we also have a responsibility to feed back on our experiences of care? And that could include trials. And I think maybe if we begin to move away from terminology like clinical trials and research and begin to call it feedback or innovation, and use sort of broader, in inverted commas, less scientific and more acceptable and perhaps more philosophically driven ideas, maybe we'll get more people interested in it. But I think for me, it's listen, stop talking, he says on a podcast, and listen. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and people have heard me say this many times, but I think it's a hint as to what makes a successful trialist or a parent or any person is try to listen twice as much as you talk. I've not been very good at that today, so apologies.
Well, no worries. Mark, how did you get into this space in the first place? How did you get to where you are?
So I qualified in pharmacy in Aberdeen in the north of Scotland back in 1990, and sitting slightly hungover in a prize giving was awarded the then Merrill Dow Prize for Pharmacy Practice, which has become a discipline. And it was really about the sort of person in medicines taking. And that's really been the theme that has driven me. So I've been very fortunate, had a wonderful career working in the NHS, developing technologies with and for patients, the King's Fund, the BBC, telecoms, traditional Chinese medicine. And then 20 years ago, I thought, what about consulting? And I did some work for AstraZeneca at the time, and also worked for Tunstall, which is a social care alarm provider. So I'd seen both the sort of health and social care, medicines and technology, and that's been the themes that have followed me through the last 20 plus years of running MD Healthcare. So it's first and foremost, where's the patient? How can we use digital as an enabler? And how can we really get innovation to scale? Because at the moment, we're very good at invention. We're not very good at adoption.
I completely agree. Well, as we start rounding off this episode, I always ask my guests the same thing. And that is, if I were to give you the Transformation Trials magic wand that can change one thing in the life sciences industry, what would you wish to change?
The language, what we talked about at the beginning. I think start to talk about, find out what's relevant to society and to individuals and to parents and patients when it comes to medicines, devices and digital health, and talk the language that they want to hear, not the language you want to transmit.
That's an excellent wish. We can spend a whole different episode talking about how do we actually make that happen.
Delighted to do it.
Well, Mark, if my listeners would like to learn more about you or have further questions about some of the ideas that you have shared, where can they find you?
At LinkedIn, I think it's either M. Duman or Mark Duman, MR Pharmacist. There's a little smiling face of me. Send me a message. Say hello. I'm embarrassed by my website. I can give you an email address and you can put that at the bottom of the podcast if that works. So yeah, either LinkedIn or an email. I'm not very good on social media. I'm 57, so that's my excuse.
Excellent.
But I need to get more digitally literate. My daughter keeps telling me.
Well, digitally literate, but at least you bring some good health literacy.
Thank you. We're trying.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Mark.
A pleasure. And as I said, very much appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, let's make things better.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. This is your host, Ivana Rosendal. I have been creating this podcast since 2021. For me, it is important that we have this sort of conversations in our industry and find common ways to transform. If you want to support this podcast, you can now do so by going to buymeacoffee/Transformation in Trials and donating. Each episode costs about $99 or €85 to produce. Also, if you are interested in becoming a guest on the show, then find a link in the show notes for how to fill out a form and pitch yourself. Thank you for now. See you next time.